My name is Rachel and I am 33 years old. My wealthy father disowned me for marrying a man he thought was poor. He looked me in the eye on my wedding day and swore there would be no inheritance, no trust fund. My husband just smiled and told me we did not need a dime. 6 months later, my parents completely froze when they found out where my husband really worked. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria cast a blinding light over the Sinclair Manufacturing Anniversary Gala. Hundreds of Wall Street executives, private equity investors, and high society socialites mingled around towering ice sculptures and lavish floral centerpieces. I adjusted the strap of my simple, unbranded black dress, feeling the familiar weight of my family's judgment from across the room. Next to me, my husband Jamal looked effortlessly handsome in a tailored charcoal suit that cost less than the appetizers being passed around on silver trays. Or at least that is what my family assumed. We had barely taken our seats at the designated family table positioned right near the grand stage when a heavy leather checkbook slammed down directly onto my silk napkin. The thud made the crystal water goblets rattle and drew the attention of several nearby guests. I looked up to see my father Richard looming over us. His face was flushed with the kind of arrogant rage he usually reserved for board meetings and underperforming employees. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I had been during the 8 months since he last spoke to me. Pay it right now or get out of my sight. My father spoke in a harsh hiss, calculated to be quiet enough to avoid a massive public scene, but loud enough for the neighboring tables to catch the hostility. I glanced at the leather folder, then back up at him, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap. Pay what exactly, Dad? He tapped a thick finger against the leather. $45,000. That is the exact amount of money I wasted on the ballroom deposit for your pathetic excuse of a wedding. Since you two decided to spit in my face on the most important day of your life, I am collecting my refund. Pay the bill, Rachel, or take your charity worker husband and move to the overflow tables by the kitchen doors where you belong. Jamal shifted beside me. He did not look angry. In fact, he looked mildly amused, taking a slow sip of his sparkling water. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate my father more. You cut off my trust fund on my wedding day, I reminded him, keeping my voice perfectly level. You refused to walk me down the aisle. You packed up your entire side of the family and walked out of the venue an hour before the ceremony. Why on earth would I owe you $45,000 for a party you boycotted? Because I paid the deposit to secure the venue, he snarled, leaning closer so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. And I only did that under the assumption that the man marrying my daughter would have the basic respect to sign the Sinclair Family Loyalty Agreement, a standard non-disclosure contract. But no, your arrogant husband here refused to sign. I remembered that contract vividly. It was not a standard non-disclosure agreement. It was a suffocating legal trap designed to give my father complete control over Jamal. The contract dictated that Jamal could never publicly speak about Sinclair Manufacturing, that he had to surrender any claim to my assets, and most insultingly, that he was forbidden from ever asking my father for a job or a loan. My father had assumed that because Jamal was a black man, working for a community organization, he was just a grifter looking for a handout from the wealthy Sinclair empire. Jamal had read the contract, laughed out loud in my father's office, and slid it back across the desk, unsigned. That was the moment my father decided to destroy our wedding. He refused to sign it because it was insulting, Dad, I said, refusing to break eye contact. Jamal works in the nonprofit sector. He has no interest in your manufacturing company. We did not want your money then, and we do not want it now. My father sneered, looking Jamal up and down with blatant disgust. He works for a pathetic urban community organization. He makes pennies. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to latch onto the Sinclair name to fund whatever little soup kitchen he runs. When I demanded legal protection, he showed his true colors. So I took my money back. You made your choice, Rachel. You chose a broke nobody over your own flesh and blood. So pay the invoice for the wasted venue deposit, or get up and go eat with the catering staff. This table is for executives and family members who actually contribute to the Sinclair legacy. He tapped the leather folder one more time for emphasis. I am waiting. I accept checks, or you can max out whatever low-limit credit cards your husband carries. The music in the ballroom swelled as the string quartet began playing a new piece. People at the adjacent tables were definitely watching now, whispering behind their champagne flutes. They were waiting for me to crumble. They were waiting for the prodigal, rebellious daughter to burst into tears and run out of the ballroom in shame, proving once again that Richard Sinclair was the absolute authority in our family. But I did not cry. The girl who used to cry over her father's cruel ultimatums died a long time ago. The woman sitting at this table was a lead risk analyst who spent her days dismantling corporate lies and auditing fraudulent empires. I dealt with men far more dangerous and far smarter than Richard Sinclair every single day. As a mergers and acquisitions auditor, my entire career was built on finding the hidden truth beneath layers of arrogance and intimidation. I slowly reached into my simple clutch purse. I did not pull out a credit card. I did not pull out a checkbook. Instead, I pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper bearing the official letterhead of the hotel where we got married. I placed the paper deliberately on top of his leather folder and slid it back across the pristine white tablecloth. You should really speak to your accounting department before you try to collect imaginary debts, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the gala. My father frowned, snatching the paper off the folder. What is this garbage? That is the final paid invoice from the wedding venue, dated the exact day of our ceremony, I explained, enunciating every word clearly. When you threw your tantrum and canceled your deposit to ruin our wedding, Jamal walked down to the management office and paid the entire balance in full, out of his own pocket. It cost $85,000 to secure the ballroom on zero notice, and he paid it in cash. We owe you absolutely nothing. My father stared at the receipt. His eyes darted across the numbers, the bold paid in full stamp, and the authorization code at the bottom. His face turned a dangerous shade of red as the reality of the document sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed caught in his throat. In fact, I continued, leaning forward slightly. The invoice you just threw at me is a complete fabrication. The $45,000 you think you spent on my wedding was actually an internal corporate expense drafted by Preston. He funneled that money out of the company accounts 2 weeks before my wedding to cover a completely different expense. You just signed off on it blindly because you were too busy trying to punish me. Before my father could process what I had just said, a sharp, mocking laugh echoed from behind me. I turned to see my younger sister Brittany striding toward the table, her arm linked with her husband Preston. Brittany was dripping in diamonds and wearing a couture gown that easily cost $10,000. Preston, a striking African-American man wearing a flashy, bespoke tuxedo, looked like the ultimate Wall Street finance bro, exuding a cocky arrogance that my father absolutely adored. Preston's face immediately tightened when he heard me mention his name, but Brittany was completely oblivious to the sudden panic flashing in her husband's eyes. She marched right up to the table, ready to defend her perfect life and her perfect husband against the sister they all considered a massive failure. Brittany opened her mouth, her perfectly glossed lips parting to deliver what was undoubtedly a rehearsed insult about my unbranded dress or my mere presence at the gala. I did not give her the chance to speak a single syllable. I kept my eyes locked on my father and tapped a manicured fingernail against the leather folder he had thrown at me. Read the vendor name on your invoice, Dad, I commanded, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the ambient noise of the ballroom. I know you are used to signing whatever Preston puts on your desk, but indulge me. Look at the letterhead. My father scowled, confused by my sudden shift in tone. He snatched the leather folder, flipping it open to glare at the paper inside. His heavy brows furrowed as he read the print. It says Apex Consulting Solutions. Exactly, I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands. It does not say the Waldorf Astoria. It does not say anything about a wedding venue, deposit catering, or event management. When you walked out of my wedding and canceled your check, Jamal walked down to the lobby and paid the $85,000 balance from his own personal accounts. Your company never paid a dime for my wedding. So I have to ask, why did Sinclair Manufacturing cut a check for $45,000 3 days after my wedding, code it as a venue cancellation fee, and route it to a Delaware shell company? The color drained from Preston's face so fast he looked physically ill. The arrogant, untouchable finance bro persona vanished in a fraction of a second. He dropped Brittany's arm and lunged across the pristine white tablecloth, his hand desperately grasping for the leather folder. "Give me that," Richard Preston stammered, knocking over a crystal water glass in his panic. The water spilled across the table, soaking into the linen. "It is a misunderstanding. Rachel does not understand high-level corporate finance. That was a strategic reallocation of bridge capital. We had vendor overlap, and I needed to amortize the losses to protect the quarterly tax filings. It is just creative accounting." My father held the folder out of Preston's reach, his eyes darting between me, the invoice, and his sweating son-in-law. "Creative accounting is a very polite term for embezzlement, Preston," I said, my voice steady. "That Delaware LLC is registered to your home address. You drafted a fake invoice, blamed it on my ruined wedding to ensure my father would sign it blindly out of spite, and pocketed $45,000 of company cash." Preston was hyperventilating now. He lunged again, his manicured fingers clawing for the paper. "Shut up, you stupid auditor," he hissed, dropping all pretense of familial civility. "You know nothing about liquidity or capital management." Before Preston could snatch the document, Jamal moved. He did not raise his voice or stand up. He simply reached out and caught Preston's wrist in a grip so firm and sudden that Preston gasped in shock. Jamal did not look like a humble charity worker in that moment. His posture shifted, radiating a cold, predatory authority that froze Preston in place. Section 1343 of the United States Code. Jamal said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous baritone that commanded the entire table. "Wire fraud, punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison. When you couple that with the falsification of corporate financial records under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, you are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence that no amount of country club lawyers can negotiate away." Preston stared at Jamal, his mouth opening and closing in mute terror. He tried to pull his wrist free, but Jamal held him effortlessly. "You used interstate wire facilities to transfer misappropriated corporate funds to a private shell entity." Jamal continued, dissecting the crime with the clinical precision of a Wall Street predator. "You pierced the corporate veil the moment you registered that LLC to your primary residence. It is sloppy work, Preston. Truly embarrassing. If Sinclair Manufacturing undergoes even a rudimentary external audit, the IRS will freeze your accounts before you can even pack a bag. So I highly suggest you sit down, lower your voice, and stop speaking to my wife with that tone." Jamal released Preston's wrist, letting the man stumble backward into a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers. Preston looked completely dismantled. The golden boy of the Sinclair family had just been verbally and legally eviscerated by a man they all considered a broke nobody. My father looked completely lost, staring at Jamal as if seeing him for the first time. The illusion of the harmless, clueless NGO worker had slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the ruthless corporate titan hiding underneath. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, but it was immediately shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Brittany slammed her champagne flute down onto the table with such force that the crystal stem snapped in her hand. She did not care that champagne splashed onto her couture gown. She was shaking with absolute fury. She could not stand seeing her husband humiliated, and she certainly could not stand seeing me acting superior. Her face twisted into an ugly, venomous sneer as she pivoted her entire attack directly onto Jamal. "How dare you speak to my husband like that, you arrogant thug!" Brittany shrieked, entirely abandoning any semblance of high society decorum. "You think knowing a few legal words makes you special. You are nothing. You are a glorified social worker surviving on food stamps and government handouts." She pointed a trembling diamond-adorned finger right at Jamal's face. "Do not try to act like you understand real money or real business. You wear cheap suits and spend your pathetic life begging for donations in the slums to fund your little homeless shelters. You probably memorize those laws because your own people get locked up for them every day. You are a joke. You married the outcast of this family because you wanted a meal ticket, and now you are both sitting here broke and bitter, trying to tear down a real man who actually knows how to provide." Brittany sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "I bet you had to take out another student loan just to afford that basic dress, Rachel. You are a broke auditor and he is a charity case. You two deserve each other." Brittany's chest heaved as champagne dripped from her hand onto the expensive carpet. I let the silence hang for exactly 2 seconds. I reached out, picked up my crystal water goblet, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked against the glass, sounding unnaturally loud in our immediate radius. Student loans, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with a distinct lack of shame. I did not look at my sister. I turned my gaze directly to my mother. Patricia was sitting frozen, her perfectly manicured hands, gripping the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles white. "You love bringing up my student loans, do you not, Brittany?" I asked, my voice projecting cleanly over the jazz playing in the background. "You love bragging to everyone in this ballroom about how you breezed through your Ivy League degree completely debt-free, while your tragic older sister had to beg the federal government for Stafford loans just to keep the lights on." Brittany lifted her chin, desperately trying to maintain her air of superiority, despite the shattered glass at her feet. "Because I actually belong in these circles, Rachel. Mom and Dad invested in the child who actually yields a return. You were always just a bad investment." I set my water glass down with a sharp thud. "They did not invest in you, Brittany. They stole for you." The whisper network at the adjacent tables amplified instantly. High-powered executives and their diamond-clad wives were blatantly turning their chairs to watch the spectacle unfold. The Sinclair family was imploding on center stage, and Wall Street loves nothing more than a front-row seat to a corporate downfall. "Let us talk about that debt-free education, Mom," I said, locking my eyes completely on Patricia. "Let us talk about the $80,000 educational trust Grandpa Arthur set up exclusively in my name before he died, the one that magically vanished the exact month I turned 18. Patricia's jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack. "Family funds are managed for the collective good of the Sinclair household, Rachel. You are being completely inappropriate and vulgar. Lower your voice immediately. Forging your 18-year-old daughter's signature on bank transfer documents is not collective management, Mom," I countered, ensuring my voice carried straight to the neighboring VIP tables. "It is a federal crime. It is felony wire fraud." My father gripped this edge of the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, but I did not let him interrupt. "You liquidated my entire future, so you could buy Brittany a silver Porsche 911 convertible," I stated, detailing the exact crime for the entire room to hear. "Why? Because she was rushing a top-tier sorority at Penn and crying on the phone every single night that the Legacy girls would not accept her if she drove a standard sedan. You committed identity theft to buy your youngest daughter friends." Brittany opened her mouth to screech a denial, but I cut her down before she could form a single syllable. "Do not even try to deny it, Britt. You parked that stolen Porsche outside the Alpha House for 4 years, pretending you were old money. You played the perfect little wealthy heiress, while your sister was working the graveyard shift at a diner off campus. I was scrubbing grease off industrial grills until 3 in the morning and eating bulk ramen just to pay for my undergraduate textbooks." I leaned closer to the center of the table, making sure my parents felt the full weight of my disgust. "I worked 3 separate jobs to fund my master's degree. I balanced ledgers for local dry cleaners, tutored entitled underclassmen who acted exactly like Brittany, and took the maximum allowable federal loans at a suffocating interest rate just to survive. I built my entire career on 60-hour work weeks, sheer exhaustion and actual merit. You built your entire socialite persona on felony fraud committed by our mother." My father, Richard, slammed his heavy fist on the table, making the silverware rattle against the fine china. "You ungrateful brat," he roared, completely losing his corporate composure. "We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We fed you. You owed us that money for everything we provided to keep you alive." "Parents are legally obligated to provide a roof, Dad," I replied with clinical precision. "They are not legally permitted to commit bank fraud to fund a luxury vehicle for their favorite child. You and Mom robbed me to fund a pathetic high society fantasy, and you have the absolute audacity to call Jamal a charity case." Jamal sat beside me, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. He did not say a word, but the look he gave Patricia made her shrink back in her chair. He was mentally logging every single crime they had just admitted to his brilliant mind, already calculating the legal repercussions they would soon face. Patricia could not take the public humiliation any longer. The murmurs from the surrounding Wall Street elites were growing louder and more toxic. Women Patricia had spent decades trying to impress were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. Whispers of embezzlement and forgery were actively spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. The polished, elegant facade of the Sinclair matriarch shattered completely, revealing the vicious, desperate woman underneath. Her face twisted into an ugly sneer, making her look 10 years older in an instant. "You insolent little snake!" Patricia hissed, abandoning her refined mid-Atlantic accent entirely. She sounded frantic, completely unhinged by the loss of her social standing. She raised her hand high in the air and snapped her fingers sharply at the hotel security director, who had been hovering nervously near the edge of the ballroom. She pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Jamal and me, signaling the security team to close in on our table. Then, with a frantic, aggressive motion, Patricia ripped open the heavy golden clasp of her crocodile Hermes bag. She plunged her hand deep inside and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed legal envelope. She slammed it onto the table right next to the puddle of spilled champagne, the heavy paper hitting the wood with a definitive smack. The heavy paper hitting the wood sent a fresh spray of champagne flying across the table. Patricia did not even flinch as the expensive vintage soaked into the bottom edge of the manila envelope. Her eyes were locked on me, blazing with a toxic mix of panic and utter ruthlessness. She pushed the envelope directly into my chest. "Open it and sign the papers inside right now." "Rachel." Patricia commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, vibrating register that cut right through the jazz music playing from the stage. I glanced down at the soaked envelope. I did not need to open it to know what it was. I had audited enough desperate corporate executives to recognize a hurried legal transfer when I saw one. "You brought a contract to an anniversary gala," I said, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap. "You really must be terrified. Sign the transfer." Patricia hissed, her manicured finger tapping the wet paper. "It is a deed of relinquishment. You are going to sign over the 5% of Sinclair Manufacturing shares that your grandfather left you. You are going to transfer them back to your father this exact second, or I swear to God, I will have the security team drag your husband out of this building by his neck and thrown into the street." Right on cue. The hotel security director stepped up to our table. He was flanked by 3 large men in dark suits. They fanned out behind Jamal, their hands clasped in front of them, projecting silent intimidation. Patricia gave the director a sharp nod, weaponizing her status as a VIP client to turn the hotel staff into her personal muscle. My father saw the guards in position and suddenly regained his false bravado. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tie as he leaned across the table to trap me between his presence and the guards. "Listen to your mother, Rachel," Richard warned, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can walk into my event and embarrass my company? You are nothing but a low-level auditor at a second-rate firm. Do you know who I play golf with? I play golf with the senior partners at your firm. I have Wall Street connections that run deeper than you could ever comprehend. I make one phone call tomorrow morning, and you will be blacklisted from the financial sector permanently. You will never audit another ledger in this city." I stared at him, absolutely mesmerized by his complete lack of self-awareness. He actually believed he was the most powerful man in the room. He had spent my entire life using financial leverage to crush anyone who disagreed with him, assuming that a loud voice and a threat to someone's livelihood would guarantee submission. "And as for your husband," Richard sneered, turning his venom toward Jamal, "you think you can assault my son-in-law and threaten my family with federal prison? I know exactly how those pathetic urban community NGOs operate. They survive on municipal grants and tax exemptions. I know the mayor. I know the city council. I will personally see to it that whatever miserable little charity you work for loses every single dime of its funding by Friday. I will crush your little operation into the dirt, and I will make sure you are both begging on the street. Now sign the damn paper and get out of my hotel." The security guards shifted closer, their heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The tension at the table was so thick it felt suffocating. Brittany crossed her arms, a smug, triumphant smile returning to her glossy lips. Preston was still breathing heavily, but he puffed his chest out clearly, relieved that Richard was taking control and directing the fire away from his massive embezzlement scheme. My parents sat there waiting for me to break. They had used these exact tactics my entire childhood: financial threats, public humiliation, physical intimidation. They expected me to grab the pen sign away, the only piece of my grandfather's legacy I had left, and run out the back doors in shame just to protect my career and my husband. Instead of signing, I reached for my water glass again. But before I could speak, a sound broke the tension. Jamal laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle or a defensive scoff. It was a deep, rich, genuinely amused laugh that rumbled from his chest. The sound was so entirely out of place, so completely devoid of fear that the security guards actually stopped moving. Richard froze, his arrogant sneer faltering as confusion washed over his face. Jamal slowly picked up his linen napkin and wiped a drop of spilled champagne off his watch face. He did not look at the security guards looming over his shoulder. He did not look at Patricia. He locked his dark, piercing eyes directly onto my father. "You are going to call the mayor to defund my NGO?" Jamal asked, his voice smooth and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "That is a fascinating strategy, Richard, truly. But it does raise a rather glaring question." Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He clasped his hands together, mirroring the exact power posture my father always tried to project, except Jamal executed it with terrifying, effortless authority. "If Sinclair Manufacturing is doing as well as you claim," Jamal said, his baritone voice carrying effortlessly over the music. "If you have all these massive Wall Street connections, if you are the untouchable titan of industry you pretend to be, then why are you resorting to petty extortion at a dinner party?" My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood was visibly draining from his face. Jamal tilted his head, his gaze boring into my father with surgical precision. "Why are you threatening to ruin your own daughter's career? Why are you ordering security guards to intimidate us? Why are you shaking with panic over a measly 5% of a failing Rust Belt manufacturing company?" Jamal let the question hang in the air for a brutal second before delivering the killing blow. "What exactly are you hiding in those ledgers, Richard? Because a man who controls an empire does not beg for 5%. A man who controls an empire does not need his wife to ambush their daughter with a soaked contract. You do not want those shares. You desperately, frantically need those shares, and I want to know why." My father did not even look at the envelope Patricia had practically thrown at me. His face was a mask of sheer indignity, turning a mottled, furious crimson as he glared directly at Jamal. "He needs that 5% as collateral for a commercial bridge loan," Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice making the nearby executives flinch and turn their heads. "Preston is expanding Sinclair Manufacturing into emerging European markets. It is a complex, highly leveraged acquisition of foreign assets. Real business. Standard corporate strategy for titans of industry. Something a street-level charity worker and a glorified bean counter could never wrap their small minds around. We need every liquid asset and equity share consolidated to secure the underwriting. It is for the growth of this family's legacy, and you owe me those shares." I stared at my father, genuinely amazed by how thoroughly he had been played by the man sitting across from him. I reached for my clutch, snapping it open and sliding out my phone. "Expansion into European markets," I repeated, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my throat. "Is that what he told you? Dad, did he use some flashy PowerPoint presentation with upward trending graphs to convince you to hand over the keys to the kingdom?" I did not just place the phone on the table. I tapped the screen, opening a highly encrypted PDF file I had prepared specifically for this evening. I turned the brightness to the maximum setting and slid the phone across the smooth tablecloth until it rested perfectly over the center of the wet deed of relinquishment. The glaring white backlight of the screen illuminated the dark, ominous seal of the Internal Revenue Service. "Take a good look at that document, Richard," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "That is not a commercial loan application, that is a federal tax lien." Preston made a choked, gasping sound. He tried to lunge across the table for the phone, his hands shaking violently, but Jamal simply shifted his weight forward. Jamal planted one broad, immovable shoulder between Preston and the table, forcing the desperate man to stop in his tracks. Preston collapsed back into his seat, his bespoke tuxedo suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his deflating, trembling frame. "Preston does not need a bridge loan for business expansion," I announced, making sure my voice carried a sharp, carrying cadence that echoed to the VIP tables. "Preston needs a bailout. A massive, desperate, illegal bailout to cover up the absolute disaster he created behind your back." My father stared at the phone screen, his eyes scanning the bold federal headers and the devastating string of zeros printed across the official document. "What is she talking about, Preston?" Richard demanded, his voice suddenly losing its ferocious edge, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. Preston opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy wheeze emerged. He could not form a single word. "I will tell you exactly what he did." I continued, standing up slowly from my chair to command the absolute attention of the table. For the past 14 months, your brilliant Ivy League son-in-law has been quietly siphoning Sinclair Manufacturing's quarterly operational funds. He bypassed the internal treasury controls you arrogantly left unguarded and wired exactly $2.4 million into a series of offshore brokerage accounts. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, staring directly into Preston's terrified eyes. He did not invest in emerging markets. He did not secure European acquisitions. He day traded our family company's operational budget on high-risk cryptocurrency derivatives. He bought into speculative digital garbage altcoins and leveraged crypto shorts, thinking he was the smartest finance bro on Wall Street. He chased yield like a desperate gambling addict, and he lost every single penny of it. Audible gas PS rippled through the surrounding tables. The word cryptocurrency hitting the ears of old money. Wall Street investors was like a dirty bomb going off in the elegant ballroom. People were actively pointing at Preston now, whispering behind their hands. "You are lying," Patricia hissed, though her entire body shook violently. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate to manage the public relations disaster unfolding in real time. "Preston is a financial prodigy. He went to Wharton. He manages our entire portfolio. He went to Wharton and learned how to gamble with other people's money." I corrected her sharply, refusing to back down. "He tried to short the crypto market to cover his initial massive losses, and he got liquidated. The $2.4 million is gone, Mom. Evaporated into the digital ether. And to make matters worse, he failed to pay the corporate taxes on the funds he initially embezzled." I tapped the phone screen one more time for absolute emphasis. "The IRS Forensic Division flagged the discrepancies 3 weeks ago. They are currently preparing to seize his personal assets, his bank accounts, and whatever shares of Sinclair Manufacturing he is legally attached to. That bridge loan you are talking about. It is a desperate, pathetic final play. He needs my 5% equity to leverage a high-interest predatory cash loan just to pay off the IRS before they indict him for tax evasion. He is using you, Dad. He is using my grandfather's legacy to buy himself out of federal prison." The ballroom felt like it was spinning around us. My father looked physically ill, his hands trembling as he picked up my phone to read the federal lien himself. Patricia was frozen, her mouth open in silent horror, as she finally realized her precious social standing was tied to a criminal idiot. Brittany, however, completely short-circuited. The reality of the situation simply bounced off her impenetrable shield of delusion. She went deathly pale, the color draining entirely from her cheeks, but she stubbornly wrapped both arms around Preston's arm and glared at me with manic defiance. "You are just jealous," Brittany yelled, her voice cracking under the intense strain. "You are fabricating these ridiculous lies. You are making up these stupid legal terms because you cannot handle the fact that my husband is a genius investor. He is a visionary. He sees market trends that you are too stupid to comprehend." She frantically snatched her quilted leather bag off the back of her chair. She slammed the pristine lambskin onto the table right next to the puddle of water and spilled champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that the liquid was soaking into the delicate couture leather. "Look at this!" Brittany cried out, gesturing wildly at the ruined purse. "Preston just bought me this limited edition Chanel bag yesterday. It cost $15,000 in cash. Do you hear me? $15,000. A man who is being investigated by the IRS does not buy his wife couture. He is rich. We are rich. You are just a bitter, broke auditor who wants to ruin our perfect life because yours is so utterly pathetic." She was panting, her chest heaving as she clung to her designer bag like it was a life preserver on a sinking ship. She looked around the room, expecting the surrounding elite guests to nod in agreement to validate her wealth and her husband's absolute genius. Instead, the wealthy socialites were looking at her with overwhelming pity and deep disgust. I looked at the soaked $15,000 bag. I looked at Preston, who was literally sweating through his expensive tailored shirt, staring blankly at the floor. And then I looked at my younger sister, who was so completely consumed by her need for superficial status that she was willing to blindly defend the man who had just bankrupted her entire family. I slowly shook my head, offering her a look of profound, devastating pity. I kept my eyes fixed on my younger sister, watching her clutch that quilted leather bag against her chest as if it were the only real thing left in her crumbling world. The pity I felt for Brittany was genuine, but it did not mean I was going to stop dismantling the lies she had built her life upon. $15,000, I repeated, letting the absurd number hang in the stale air between us. Brittany, a man facing a federal tax lien, does not walk into a Chanel boutique on Fifth Avenue and drop 15 grand in cash. He goes to Canal Street. Brittany blinked rapidly, her face scrunching in defensive confusion. What are you talking about? It came with an authenticity card and a dust bag. He bought it straight from the showroom. It came with a piece of plastic printed in a basement in Guangzhou. I corrected her, my voice slicing through the remaining murmurs of the adjacent tables. Look at the hardware, Brittany. The gold plating on the interlocking clasp is far too yellow, and the stitching on the back pocket does not align with the quilting on the main body of the bag. The leather is machine-stamped calfskin, not lambskin. It is a super fake, a high-tier counterfeit. Preston bought it from a replica dealer online for maybe $400 and pocketed whatever cash you thought he spent on you. Preston flinched as if I had physically struck him in the jaw. He opened his mouth to deny it, but his voice completely failed him, leaving him gasping silently like a beached fish. You are lying, Brittany gasped, looking down at the bag in her hands as if it had suddenly caught fire. You are just trying to humiliate him because you are jealous. I do not need to try, I said, picking up my phone and swiping to open a secondary highly encrypted file. Preston does an excellent job of humiliating himself without any assistance from me. I tapped the screen and projected the new document directly over the center of the table. It was a consolidated credit card statement heavily highlighted in neon yellow. Since we are discussing Preston's spending habits, I continued leaning forward to ensure my parents had a clear view of the screen. Let us look at his activities from 2 weekends ago. You remember that weekend, do you not, Brittany? Preston told you he was flying to Chicago for a mandatory Sinclair Manufacturing Emergency Board meeting. He said he was locked in a conference room trying to save Dad's company. Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the highlighted lines on the screen. He was in Miami, I stated flatly. Specifically, he was occupying a penthouse suite at the Setai in South Beach. The receipts show $5,000 in poolside cabana rentals, $3,000 in luxury spa treatments, and a remarkably expensive dinner at Carbone. My father, who had been staring at the table in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly jerked his head up. Miami. We do not have any operational assets or board members in Florida. No, you do not, Dad, I agreed, turning my icy gaze back to Preston. But Preston's 24-year-old personal assistant, Chloe, certainly enjoyed the assets he brought with him. He used the last remaining shreds of the corporate funds he embezzled to play sugar daddy for the weekend. The flights, the hotel, the vintage champagne, all of it was billed to a hidden Sinclair corporate card, while he left his loyal wife at home and the IRS drafted his asset seizure documents. Brittany stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes dragged themselves away from the phone screen and locked on to Preston. The silence at our table was absolute, broken only by the distant, oblivious jazz music floating from the stage. Tell me she is making this up, Brittany whispered, her voice trembling with a frantic, desperate edge. Preston, tell me she is lying. Preston could not look at her. He stared at the ruined tablecloth, his jaw working uselessly, sweat pooling at his temples and dripping down his neck. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly made. I watched him wither, feeling a cold, righteous anger finally surface. For years, Preston had strutted through our family gatherings acting like he owned the world. He had built his entire identity within the Sinclair family by playing the role of the perfect, acceptable black son-in-law. He knew exactly what my father wanted, a ruthless, wealth-obsessed mirror image of himself, and Preston had happily contorted himself to fit the mold. You spent the last 5 years trying to prove you were better than Jamal, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. Every Thanksgiving, every Sunday dinner, you made sure to mock Jamal's community work. You laughed at his salary, you threw him under the bus just to show my father that you were one of the good ones. You traded your own dignity to prove you belonged in a family that only valued you for how much money you could generate. Jamal, who had been watching Preston with a look of calm, clinical detachment, finally spoke. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, his movements smooth and deliberate. That is the true irony here, Preston, Jamal said, his rich baritone voice cutting straight to the bone. You sold out your own soul to impress a man who never actually respected you. You played the cutthroat Wall Street stereotype because you thought it made you safe. You looked down on my work in the community, calling it pathetic, while you secretly gambled away millions and bought counterfeit handbags to keep up an illusion. And for what? You are going to federal prison for defrauding a failing Rust Belt manufacturing company owned by a father-in-law who will turn his back on you the second the handcuffs click. Preston looked up at Jamal, his eyes red and brimming with pathetic, humiliated tears. The complete destruction of his ego was absolute. He had nothing left. No money, no status, no fake prestige. Brittany let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. The delusion that had shielded her for her entire adult life, violently shattered. She realized she was not the wealthy, envied socialite she pretended to be. She was the wife of a broke, cheating felon who gave her fake Chanel bags while spending company money on his assistant. Brittany lunged forward and slapped Preston across the face with everything she had. The sharp, echoing crack of her palm, striking his cheek, stopped conversations dead at 3 different VIP tables. Preston recoiled, holding his reddening face, but Brittany did not stop. She grabbed the counterfeit bag she had been defending moments ago and swung it at his head, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You liar!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the elegant ballroom, completely obliterating any remaining dignity the Sinclair family possessed. "You broke, cheating, pathetic liar. You ruined my life." Preston threw his hands up, trying to block her blows, shouting back defensively as the golden couple devolved into a vicious physical screaming match right in the middle of the Waldorf Astoria. The high society guests they had spent years trying to impress were now actively pulling out their cell phones to record the spectacle. My father's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The public humiliation was too much for his fragile ego to process. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor, and slammed both of his heavy fists onto the table with enough force to rattle the remaining crystal. "Enough," Richard roared, demanding silence. The sharp cracking echo of Richard's voice silenced the entire VIP section of the ballroom. Waiters froze, mid-step trays hovering dangerously in the air. The string quartet playing softly on the far stage faltered, producing a discordant, ugly screech before abruptly halting the music. Brittany lowered her hand, her chest heaving as she stared at our father in shock. Preston kept his head down, rubbing his raw, bright red cheek, completely neutralized. "You actually think this is about him?" Richard hissed, pointing a violently trembling finger at Preston's cowering form. My father was hyperventilating now. His chest rose and fell in sharp, jagged movements, tearing at the seams of his tailored tuxedo. He was shedding his polished, aristocratic skin, revealing the desperate, cornered rat underneath. "You think I give a damn about his pathetic offshore brokerage accounts or his fake designer garbage? You think I brought a legal deed of relinquishment to a public anniversary gala to save this absolute idiot from the IRS?" I stayed perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, letting him dig his own grave. "Sinclair Manufacturing is bleeding." Richard confessed the admission, ripping out of his throat like a physical injury. The veins in his neck strained against his starched white collar. "We are hemorrhaging cash. The global supply chain disruptions crippled our production lines 2 years ago, and the legacy contracts dried up right after. We are drowning in operational debt. We have exactly 3 weeks of payroll left before the entire corporation defaults and the bank sees everything." "Richard, stop," Patricia pleaded, grabbing his forearm, her manicured nails digging into his sleeve. Her eyes darted frantically toward the wealthy socialite staring at us. "Not here, not in front of all these people." He violently shook her off, nearly knocking her out of her chair. "She needs to know why she is signing." He snapped, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he glared at me. "The 5% of equity you hold is not collateral for a commercial bridge loan. There is no bridge loan. No reputable bank in this hemisphere will lend us another dime. I need your shares because I need 100% shareholder alignment. Total absolute equity consolidation." I raised a single eyebrow. Alignment for what, Richard? For a buyout, he sneered, a desperate manic pride suddenly replacing his panic. He adjusted his lapels, trying to summon the ghost of his former corporate authority. "A total unconditional acquisition." I secured a lifeline. A massive Tier 1 private equity firm out of New York, Vanguard Apex. He practically spat the name at me, wielding it like a heavy, blunt weapon. "You know exactly who they are, Rachel. Even a low-level auditor at a second-rate firm knows the name Vanguard Apex. They are the most ruthless, aggressive corporate titans in the American financial sector. They are not local bankers. They are Wall Street royalty. They buy legacy manufacturing plants, strip the dead weight, restructure the supply chains, and flip the assets for billions. They are sharks, and they are buying Sinclair Manufacturing for a massive premium that will save this entire family from ruin. He braced his hands on the table, leaning closer. Their senior acquisition representatives are flying in tomorrow morning. They are sending their top closers to our headquarters to finalize the paperwork at 9 sharp. But Vanguard Apex does not deal in fractured equity. They do not negotiate with minor shareholders. They demand absolute compliance. They require a clean table. 100% of the voting shares must be transferred at the exact time of signing. If there is a single holdout, if there is a fraction of a percent unaccounted for, they walk away and leave us to burn. He pointed a stiff finger at the soaked envelope resting between us. That is why you are going to sign that deed. You are going to sign your 5% back to me tonight, so I can hand this company over to Vanguard Apex tomorrow morning. Richard then turned his gaze toward Brittany. My sister was still weeping softly, but as she listened to her father's grand rescue plan, a sickening transformation occurred. The devastation on her face melted away, instantly replaced by the same arrogant, entitled smirk she had worn all evening. She wiped a tear from her cheek and lifted her chin, reassured that her wealth was secure. When that buyout money hits the accounts, it will wipe away everything, Richard declared, his voice ringing with cruel authority. It will pay off Preston's federal tax lien. It will keep your sister out of bankruptcy. The millions from Vanguard Apex will set Brittany up for life, ensuring she never has to worry about a single financial misstep her husband made. She will remain completely untouchable. She will keep her house, her cars, and her status. He snapped his eyes back to me, his lips curling into a vicious, triumphant sneer. And you will get exactly what you deserve for trying to humiliate us tonight. Nothing. You will cut yourself out of this family forever. You sign those shares away, and you walk out of this hotel with zero. You will watch your sister live in luxury, while you audit spreadsheets for the rest of your miserable middle-class life. You will save this family, and you will reap absolutely none of the rewards. The silence that followed his tirade was deafening. My father stood there breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had played his ultimate trump card. He had laid out his grand master plan, certain that a combination of family guilt and his sheer overbearing intimidation would finally force my hand. He expected me to crumble, to pick up a pen and surrender my grandfather's legacy, just to spare my sister from the consequences of her own choices. I looked down at the soaked champagne-stained deed of relinquishment resting on the table. Before I could open my mouth to respond, Jamal shifted in his seat. His movements were slow, fluid, and completely unbothered by my father's screaming. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. He smoothly withdrew a sleek matte black metal pen. It was a heavy, expensive writing instrument, the exact kind used by executives for signing major corporate contracts. He held it between his long fingers for a fraction of a second, letting the polished dark metal catch the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. With an expression of absolute terrifying calm, Jamal reached across the table and placed the black pen directly on top of the wet contract right in front of my hands. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his dark eyes locking onto my father. Well, Jamal said, his rich baritone voice carrying a razor-sharp edge of amusement, do you want to sign it? Patricia let out a sharp, derisive scoff, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace as she looked down her nose at my husband. She reached out and flicked the pen with her manicured fingernail. Put that cheap flea market junk away, Patricia snapped, her voice dripping with pure elitist contempt. This is a legally binding corporate transfer, not a sign-in sheet at one of your miserable little community centers. We do not need your dollar store office supplies, contaminating a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Jamal did not flinch. He did not even blink. He just sat there, exuding a terrifying, unshakable calm that seemed to infuriate my mother even more. You sit there looking so smug, Patricia continued, leaning over the table to glare at him. You think exposing Preston means you have won something. You think dragging our family's private matters into the light makes you our equal. It does not. You are nothing but a glorified social worker surviving on municipal grants and homeless shelter handouts. You have absolutely no concept of how real wealth operates in this country. You should be taking notes right now. You should be observing how true power moves. Patricia practically vibrated with arrogant pride as she invoked the name of the private equity firm Richard had just mentioned. Vanguard Apex is coming tomorrow, Patricia said, pronouncing the name as if it were a sacred incantation. Do you even comprehend what that means? The CEO of Vanguard Apex is a ruthless, untouchable billionaire. He is a faceless titan of industry who buys and sells failing operations before breakfast. He does not care about feelings. He does not care about community outreach. He operates on pure, unadulterated financial dominance. Men like him are the predators of the corporate food chain, and men like you are the plankton. When his representatives walk into our headquarters tomorrow morning, they will hand us a check that will render your entire lifetime of charitable groveling completely irrelevant. So put your little pen away, tell your wife to sign the document with the hotel's Mont Blanc, and get out of our sight before I have security throw you onto the pavement. I looked at Patricia, entirely mesmerized by her blind, staggering arrogance. She was worshipping the very ground of a billionaire she had never met, using a phantom CEO as a weapon to belittle the man sitting right in front of her. I slowly reached out and picked up the matte black pen Jamal had placed on the table. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, crafted from solid cold metal. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the smooth, expensive weight of it as I turned my attention back to my parents. You always loved to mock my career, Mom, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. A low-level auditor, a glorified bean counter, someone with a small mind who just checks boxes and punches calculator keys. Richard crossed his arms, his face still flushed with deep red rage. Just sign the damn paper, Rachel. We do not have time for another one of your defensive monologues. But I kept my eyes locked on Patricia, tracing the sleek lines of the metal pen. Have you ever heard the term due diligence? I asked, my voice deadly calm. It is a very specific, very brutal phase in mergers and acquisitions. When a private equity firm like Vanguard Apex decides to buy a legacy company, they do not just look at the glossy revenue projections Richard prints out on nice cardstock. They hire people exactly like me. I stood up, holding the pen firmly in my right hand, commanding the space. For the past 7 years, I have worked grueling 80-hour weeks conducting M&A audits, I explained, making sure every single word landed like a physical blow. I do not just check math. I tear apart corporate financial lies. I rip open hidden ledgers. I hunt down toxic assets, shadow debts, and fraudulent executives who think they are smart enough to hide their embezzlement in offshore crypto accounts. I strip a company down to its bare, ugly bones, so the buyers know exactly what kind of rot they are purchasing. Preston visibly shrank into his chair, his eyes darting to the exits as if calculating his chances of escaping the hotel before the authorities arrived. You think Vanguard Apex is just going to blindly hand you millions of dollars tomorrow morning? I asked, letting a cold, mocking smile touch my lips. You think a ruthless, faceless billionaire CEO simply writes a check without ordering a total forensic dissection of Sinclair Manufacturing first? You think they do not already know that your supply lines are dead, your payroll is bouncing, and your golden boy son-in-law just incinerated $2.4 million of operational liquidity? Richard slammed his hand on the table again, the raw panic finally breaking completely through his arrogant facade. I told you to sign the deed. You are wasting time. Sign the transfer right now so I can present a clean cap table to the buyers tomorrow. You want a clean table? I asked, looking directly into my father's wide, desperate eyes. I shifted my grip on the pen, curling my fingers tightly around the cool metal barrel. I positioned the sharp tungsten nib directly over the signature line of the soaked champagne-stained deed of relinquishment. Richard let out a loud breath of relief, assuming I was finally submitting to his demands. Patricia crossed her arms, a triumphant, condescending smirk returning to her face as she prepared to watch me surrender my grandfather's legacy. Instead of signing my name, I raised my fist and drove the heavy metal pen straight down. With a violent, tearing crunch, the sharp nib pierced cleanly through the thick legal paper and jammed a full inch deep into the solid mahogany wood of the dining table. The sudden sound made Brittany shriek and jump backward. Richard gasped, stumbling away from the table as if the pen had been aimed at his chest. Before anyone could process what I had done, I grabbed the top right corner of the deed. I ripped my arm back with vicious force. The wet, heavy paper tore violently against the pinned metal nib, ripping the legal document completely in half. I tossed the shredded remains of my father's final lifeline directly into the puddle of spilled champagne. Richard stared at the ruined, useless paper floating in the alcohol. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood rushed to his face so violently, I thought he might actually have a stroke right there in the VIP section. He was hyperventilating, his hands clawing at the edge of the table as he realized his absolute control had just been entirely shattered. He spun around, nearly knocking over a passing waiter, and frantically flagged down the hotel manager who was hovering nervously near the grand staircase. "I need the police!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he grabbed the terrified manager by the lapels of his uniform. "Call 911 immediately." The manager, a polished man in a pristine tuxedo, blanched. "Sir, please lower your voice. We can handle any disturbances with our internal security." "I said call the police!" Richard roared, his eyes wild and unhinged, as he reached into his own jacket and ripped out his cell phone. "I will do it myself." He punched the numbers with shaking fingers, lifting the phone to his ear, while glaring directly at Jamal. Richard was no longer a businessman negotiating a deal. He was a cornered predator resorting to the absolute lowest, most dangerous tactic in his arsenal. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Yes, I have an emergency at the Waldorf Astoria." Richard barked into the phone, his voice deliberately loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear every word. "I need officers immediately to the main ballroom. I am being threatened by a dangerous, aggressive trespasser." My stomach plummeted. I stepped around the table, putting myself between my father and my husband, but Jamal gently caught my hand, his thumb tracing my knuckles in a calming rhythm. "He is hostile and refusing to leave." Richard continued, his voice taking on a frantic, manufactured tone of terror. "He is a large black man, completely out of control. He has already assaulted one of my family members and is threatening the rest of us. Send an armed unit. We are in immediate danger." Patricia stepped right up next to him, amplifying the deadly lie. "Tell them he is unstable," she hissed loud enough for the dispatcher to hear through the phone. "Tell them we fear for our lives. He is unpredictable." I stared at my parents, absolutely disgusted by the depths of their depravity. They were weaponizing Jamal's race, banking on systemic bias and police escalation, to intimidate him into fleeing the hotel. They assumed the mere threat of an armed police response against a black man in a high-end, predominantly white space would terrify him into running out the back door, leaving me vulnerable and completely isolated. "You are calling the police on a quiet man sitting in a chair because you lost an argument about a spreadsheet," I said, my voice echoing with pure revulsion. "My sister just committed physical assault with a counterfeit bag in front of 100 witnesses, and you are trying to frame my husband as a violent threat. This is a new level of sickness even for you, Richard." Richard ignored me, lowering his phone with a vicious, triumphant smirk. "They are 2 minutes away. You want to play games with my legacy? Let us see how confident your charity worker feels when he is in handcuffs." Through the entire display of blatant, weaponized racism, Jamal did not move a single muscle. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice to defend himself. He did not give them a single micro-expression of anger that they could use to justify their lies. Instead, Jamal reached out with steady, perfectly calm hands and picked up his crystal glass of sparkling water. He took a slow, deliberate sip, the ice clinking softly against the rim. He lowered the glass, resting his elbows on the arms of his chair, and looked at my father with an expression of profound, unshakable boredom. The wait was agonizing. The tension in the ballroom was so thick, it felt like the air itself had crystallized. The hotel security staff formed a wide perimeter around our table, terrified to intervene, but unable to leave. Preston was still whimpering softly into a linen napkin. Brittany stood frozen, glaring at Preston with absolute venom, completely ignoring the fact that her father had just initiated a potentially lethal police encounter. The heavy polished brass doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a loud echoing crash. The chatter in the room instantly died. 4 armed police officers strode into the ballroom, their heavy-duty boots thudding aggressively against the hardwood floor. They were led by a stern, broad-shouldered precinct captain whose eyes immediately swept the room, searching for the violent disturbance that had been reported over the dispatch radio. Richard's face lit up with malicious glee. He stepped out from behind the table, throwing his arm out and pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Jamal, who was still sitting calmly with his glass of water. "There he is. He is Richard shouted, his voice ringing with absolute entitlement. Arrest him immediately. The four uniformed officers immediately unclipped their heavy radios, spreading out in a calculated tactical formation to create a tight perimeter around our table. The hotel guests in the surrounding VIP section shrank back into their seats, their earlier whispers replaced by the terrifying reality of an active police response. Several wealthy socialites discreetly raised their cell phones, the camera lenses focused squarely on my husband. The precinct captain, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a severe buzz cut, stepped directly toward Jamal. His right hand rested casually but deliberately on the thick black leather of his utility belt, inches from his service weapon. His sharp, assessing eyes swept over Jamal, taking in the tailored suit and the relaxed posture before flicking toward my father. Richard was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He gripped the edge of the ruined dining table, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. "Officer, thank God you are here!" Richard gasped, his voice trembling with a perfectly manufactured layer of panic. This man invaded a private, highly secure corporate gala. He has already violently assaulted my son-in-law and is actively threatening the physical safety of my entire family. I demand he be removed from these premises and placed under arrest immediately. Patricia practically lunged forward to assist the charade, clutching her heavy diamond necklace as if she were protecting it from a mugging. "He is completely unstable," Patricia cried out, her voice pitching into a shrill, theatrical wail. "He came to our table unprovoked. He is aggressive, he is dangerous, and he refused to leave when we asked. Please, you have to get him away from us before he hurts someone." The racial profiling was so blatant, so disgustingly transparent, it made my stomach churn. My parents were eagerly weaponizing Jamal's race, leveraging the ugly systemic bias of an armed police response to intimidate a black man out of a high society ballroom. They fully expected the captain to drag Jamal out in handcuffs, leaving me isolated, humiliated, and utterly defenseless against their corporate demands. Jamal did not stand up. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He did not utter a single word of defense or offer a micro-expression of anger that the officers could use to justify an escalation. Instead, Jamal calmly reached for his crystal glass, took another slow, deliberate sip of his sparkling water, and set it back down on the table with a soft clink. He looked up at the towering police captain with a gaze of profound, unshakable boredom. "Sir," the captain barked, his voice a low, lethal command that cut through my mother's fake sobbing. "I need you to stand up, keep your hands exactly where I can see them, and provide a government-issued identification. Right now." Richard practically vibrated with malicious joy. A triumphant, vicious smirk spread across his sweaty face as he looked down at me, silently promising that my defiance had just cost me everything. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs, entirely unbothered by the four armed officers surrounding my husband. I looked directly into my father's bloodshot eyes. "You really do not understand how actual power operates in this city," Richard, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dead silence of the ballroom. "You have spent your entire life playing the role of a big executive, assuming that a loud tuxedo and a fake police report make you a king. But you have no idea who actually runs the financial sector." Patricia sneered, dropping her fake tears for a moment. "Shut your mouth, Rachel. The adults are speaking." I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked on my father. "You always loved to mock my career. You called me a glorified bean counter. But when you spend 7 years auditing the ghosts of Wall Street, working grueling 80-hour weeks, tearing apart corporate financial lies, you learn a few hard truths." I tilted my head, letting a cold smile touch my lips. True apex predators do not carry standard driver's licenses. The billionaires who can liquidate a municipal pension fund or buy a legacy manufacturing plant before breakfast do not hand over plastic state ID cards to prove they exist. Their corporate ties own the buildings, the banks, and the very ground you are standing on. Their identity is their infrastructure. The police captain glared at me, clearly losing his patience with the wealthy family drama. I said, "ID. Now." Jamal let out a soft, dismissive breath. He slowly, deliberately reached his right hand toward the inner breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. Two of the younger officers instantly tensed their hands, dropping heavily onto the grips of their holstered weapons. "Sir, stop moving," one of them ordered, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. "Keep your hands visible." Jamal ignored the command entirely. His movements remained smooth, elegant, and entirely unthreatening. He withdrew his hand from the interior of his jacket, holding a single solid object between his long fingers. It was not a leather wallet. It was not a plastic state identification card. It was a heavy matte black titanium business card. The metal caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, absorbing the glare into its dark, flawless surface. There was no company logo plastered across the front. There was no phone number. There was only a minimalist, perfectly embossed silver crest and a single name etched into the center of the heavy metal plate. Jamal extended his hand, offering the cold titanium card directly to the police captain. The captain hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching the metal card from Jamal's fingers. He looked down, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "Arrest him," Richard demanded, slamming his fist onto the table again. "Stop indulging this arrogant trespasser and put him in handcuffs. He is stalling." But the captain did not move. He stared at the matte black card in his hand. The solid, unnatural weight of the titanium seemed to anchor him to the floor. His eyes tracked over the embossed silver lettering, the intricate, unmistakable crest of Vanguard Apex, the title positioned just beneath the name, Chief Executive Officer. The absolute terrifying realization slammed into the police captain like a freight train. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The heavy, aggressive authority he had carried into the ballroom completely evaporated. He realized with sickening clarity that he was currently attempting to interrogate the single most powerful financial titan on the eastern seaboard. A man whose corporate umbrella likely owned the hotel, the surrounding city blocks, and funded the municipal bonds that paid the police department's pensions. The captain swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. His hands began to shake as he carefully, almost reverently, handed the heavy titanium card back to Jamal. Jamal took the card, slipping it back into his breast pocket without a single word. "Stand down," the captain ordered, his voice tight and urgent. He shot a frantic look at his three officers, gesturing sharply with his hand. "I said stand down. Step back. Keep your hands off your belts." The officers looked utterly bewildered, but they instantly obeyed their commanding officer, taking 2 large steps backward and dropping their hands to their sides. Richard froze. His triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated confusion. "What are you doing?" my father yelled, his voice cracking in panic. "I am the CEO of Sinclair Manufacturing. I ordered you to remove him. Arrest him right now." The police captain slowly turned away from Jamal. He looked at Richard, his expression a mixture of profound disbelief and pure, furious contempt. He stepped right up to the edge of the ruined dining table, staring down at my sweating, hyperventilating father. "Sir," the captain said, his voice dropping to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. "Are you out of your mind?" "What did you just say to me?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking violently, pitching up into a shrill, hysterical frequency. "I gave you a direct order. I am the CEO of this company. I am the host of this gala. I pay the taxes that fund your department. Why are you not arresting this broke charity worker? Put him in handcuffs right now and get him out of my sight." The police captain did not even flinch at my father's screaming. Instead, he took another deliberate step away from our table, distancing himself from Richard, as if my father were suddenly coated in a highly contagious disease. The captain turned his entire massive frame toward Jamal. With a stiff, highly practiced motion of absolute respect, he extended his hand and returned the matte black titanium card. "My deepest apologies for the interruption, sir," the captain said, his voice ringing with crisp, undeniable deference. "We received a panicked dispatch regarding a violent threat. It is glaringly obvious there has been a massive misunderstanding on the caller's part. We will secure the perimeter of your table immediately to ensure you are not bothered further." "Thank you, Captain," Jamal replied, his voice smooth and steady, as he slid the heavy metal card back into his tailored jacket. "I appreciate your prompt response to a false alarm. Please ensure my wife and I have a clear path to the exits when we conclude our business here tonight." "Yes, sir," the captain barked. He gave a sharp, definitive nod before signaling his men. The armed officers instantly rotated, turning their backs to Jamal and me. They formed a tight protective wall around our section, effectively boxing Richard and Patricia in rather than dragging Jamal out. They had become our personal security detail. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Her hands flew to her throat, her perfectly manicured nails clawing frantically at her heavy diamond necklace. She stared at the police officer standing guard, her entire elitist worldview violently short-circuiting in real time. "What is happening?" Patricia shrieked, looking wildly around the ballroom, desperately seeking an explanation that made sense to her prejudiced mind. "Why are you calling him sir? He is a nobody. He is a fraud. He works at a homeless shelter." Jamal placed his hands flat on the ruined mahogany table and slowly pushed himself up from his chair. The physical difference between my husband and my father was suddenly overwhelmingly palpable. Richard was a man rapidly crumbling under the weight of his own failures, his tuxedo soaked in sweat, his posture stooped and jagged with sheer panic. Jamal stood at 6'3", a monolith of perfectly tailored charcoal wool and quiet, terrifying power. He did not need to shout. He did not need to hyperventilate or slam his fists. He commanded the space simply by occupying it. Jamal looked down at Patricia, his dark eyes entirely stripped of the polite, accommodating warmth he had worn for the last 7 years. The respectful, quiet son-in-law she had continuously mocked was gone. In his place stood the apex predator Patricia had just spent 10 minutes blindly worshipping. "I do not work at a community center, Patricia," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a lethal, icy register that sent a visible, violent shiver down my mother's spine. "I fund the community center. I fund the entire municipal NGO sector of this city. Vanguard Apex maintains a philanthropic arm for strategic tax mitigation and localized asset development. I sit on the board of those charities to monitor exactly where my capital is being deployed." "You confused a man surveying his investments with a man begging for a paycheck." Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a vacant chair. His mouth opened, forming a silent, horrified circle. "Vanguard." Richard choked out, his eyes darting frantically to the shredded deed of relinquishment soaking in the spilled champagne. "That is impossible. You are lying. You." "Me," Jamal confirmed, stepping around the table to tower directly over my father. Jamal dropped the polite, accessible facade entirely. When he spoke next, his vocabulary shifted effortlessly into the high-level predatory Wall Street jargon that Richard had spent his entire life pretending to master. "You have been running Sinclair Manufacturing into the ground for a decade, Richard," Jamal stated, his tone clinical, precise, and utterly merciless. "Your operational liquidity is a complete joke. Your debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic. You leveraged your primary assembly lines against high-yield short-term commercial paper that you mathematically cannot repay. You thought you were smart. You thought you could hide your gross incompetence behind aggressive PR campaigns and lavish anniversary galas. But capital does not care about your tuxedo. Capital only cares about leverage, and you have absolutely zero." Richard raised a trembling hand, trying to formulate a defense, trying to salvage any shred of his shattered ego, but his throat was completely dry. I was looking at the ghost of his own ruin, wearing the face of the man he had spent years dismissing. "When your corporate brokers came crawling to my firm, begging for a lifeline, they tried to sell me a fabricated valuation." Jamal continued, backing Richard further into the corner with every word. "They presented falsified quarterly projections. They tried to hide the fact that Preston systematically embezzled millions to fund his Miami pool parties. But I do not buy blindly. I sent my best forensic auditor to tear your books apart line by line. I sent my wife." Brittany let out a loud, pathetic sob, shrinking into her chair as she finally realized that the sister she had spent her entire life mocking was the very executioner holding the axe over her neck. Preston was practically hyperventilating into a linen napkin, realizing his federal crimes were fully documented by the very billionaire buying the company. "Rachel found the rot," Jamal said, glancing at me with a look of absolute burning pride that made my heart soar. "She documented the fraud. She mapped the offshore shell companies. She handed me the exact blueprint of your failure. You thought Vanguard Apex was flying in tomorrow to save you. We are not. I authorized the acquisition strategy specifically to initiate a hostile takeover. We are not buying you out, Richard. We are stripping your assets, liquidating your patents, and dissolving your legacy into scrap." Patricia covered her face with her hands, a long, keening wail escaping her lips as the reality of their total financial annihilation finally set in. They were not just broke. They were publicly exposed, humiliated, and legally cornered. Jamal did not give them a single second to recover. He turned away from my weeping parents and looked past the ring of silent police officers. He locked eyes with the technical director standing in the raised audio-visual booth at the back of the grand ballroom. Jamal raised his hand and snapped his fingers, a sharp cracking sound that echoed like a gunshot over the quiet crowd. "You," Jamal called out, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. "Switch the main gala projector to my laptop input, right now." The terrified technician in the sound booth hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He looked down at the floor, saw the police captain aggressively gesturing for him to comply, and instantly slammed his hand onto the main control board. The massive 30-foot LED screens flanking the main stage flickered. The opulent gold-embossed logo of Sinclair Manufacturing, the symbol of my father's entire identity and ego, suddenly dissolved into black pixels. A second later, a new image materialized. It was stark. It was modern. It was the razor-sharp, imposing silver crest of Vanguard Apex. And right beneath that crest, projected in massive, undeniable typography, read the corporate profile under and Chief Executive Officer, Jamal Washington. The entire ballroom, packed with 500 of the city's most elite, wealthy, and arrogant guests, went dead silent. It was a suffocating, absolute silence. Not a single crystal glass clinked. Not a single breath was drawn. The wealthy socialites who had been eagerly recording the police encounter lowered their cell phones, their mouths dropping open in synchronized, paralyzed shock. Jamal buttoned the center button of his charcoal suit jacket. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stepping away from the ruined dining table and walking right down the center aisle of the VIP section toward the stage. The crowd parted him, instinctively, physically repelled by the massive gravitational shift in power. He did not rush. He did not shout. He simply owned the floor. "You have a fascinating definition of wealth," Richard Jamal called out, his voice echoing perfectly through the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. "You evaluate a man by the designer label on his suit, or the manufactured prestige of his last name. You measure power by how loudly someone yells at a waiter or how quickly they call the police on a black man in a tuxedo. But you lack the fundamental capacity to understand real capital." Jamal climbed the short stairs to the stage and turned to face my father. The towering Vanguard Apex logo framed his shoulders perfectly. "Real power does not scream for the authorities when it gets outsmarted," Jamal stated, his tone clinical, precise, and utterly merciless. "Real power does not need to belittle community organizers to feel big. For the past decade, you have sat at the head of every Thanksgiving table treating me like a charity case. You mocked my work. You mocked my salary. You told your country club friends I was a glorified social worker surviving on your tax dollars." Jamal laughed, a rich, dark sound that held absolutely no warmth. "I built Vanguard Apex from the dirt up. I did not inherit a trust fund. I did not take over a daddy's business. I built a quantitative analysis firm in a 2-room office and scaled it into a private equity titan that manages $40 billion in assets. We swallow failing, pathetic legacy companies like yours for sport. I fund the municipal grants you complain about because my personal portfolio generates enough capital in a single morning to buy your entire factory floor and bulldoze it for a parking lot." Richard was physically crumbling. He staggered backward, his expensive dress shoes tangling in the heavy carpet. He clutched the back of Patricia's chair for support, his chest heaving as he stared at the massive projection looming directly behind the man he had spent years degrading. "The irony is truly staggering," Jamal said, pacing slowly across the stage, looking down at my parents like a scientist observing insects. "For the past 6 months, you have been begging for a meeting with my firm. You called my private acquisitions office 14 times. You sent expensive vintage scotch to my managing directors. You sent desperate, groveling emails pleading for a 10-minute phone call with the CEO of Vanguard Apex to save your dying company." Jamal stopped, pointing a long, steady finger directly at Richard. "You offered to surrender your voting rights. You offered to sell your family estate. You were begging for a lifeline from the very man sitting across from you at Sunday dinner. You were pleading for salvation from the son-in-law you thought was too poor to understand your business. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, your own bigotry, and your own fragile ego that you never even bothered to run a background check on the man who married your daughter." Patricia let out a whimpering, strangled gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands in absolute horror. Her eyes darted wildly between Jamal and the massive screen. The billionaire titan she had just praised to the heavens, the ruthless corporate predator she had worshipped mere minutes ago, was the same man she had just told to get out of her sight. Her entire social hierarchy had inverted and crushed her underneath it. Preston had slid so far down in his seat he was practically under the table. He recognized instantly that the CEO of Vanguard Apex could have him investigated, indicted, and federally prosecuted with a single phone call. Brittany sat her fake Chanel bag, completely forgotten, her eyes wide as she realized her sister was married to a billionaire while she was chained to a broke, cheating felon. Richard was hyperventilating now. His face was devoid of all color, drained of all blood. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner pull the lever. He opened his mouth, trying to form an apology, trying to pivot, trying to salvage the unsalvageable. Jamal, Richard rasped his voice, a pathetic, wheezing croak. Jamal, we can discuss this. We are family. The buyout. We can structure a deal. Jamal smiled. It was a terrifying, cold expression that promised absolute ruin. He shook his head slowly, stepping down from the stage and walking back toward our table. The police officers immediately stepped aside to let him pass. He came to stand right beside me, placing a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. Don't look at me, Richard, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. I am just the money. You should be worried about the auditor. The massive screens behind the Sinclair anniversary stage continued to project the imposing razor-sharp silver crest of Vanguard Apex. The opulent gold Sinclair logo was completely gone, erased by the digital footprint of my husband's financial empire. The visual dominance bathed the entire ballroom in a cold metallic light. 500 of the city's most elite, wealthy, and arrogant guests remained absolutely dead silent. They were frozen in their seats, their expensive champagne glasses resting forgotten on pristine white tablecloths. No one dared to speak. They were collectively watching a titan of local industry be publicly and ruthlessly dismantled. Jamal had just delivered the final crushing blow. He stood tall and unbothered, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He offered my father a terrifying, predatory smile before delivering his final line, telling Richard not to look at him because he was just the money. Jamal tilted his head toward me, passing the executioner's axe directly into my hands. Slowly, as if pulled by a massive, invisible gravitational force, every single pair of eyes at our table snapped away from the towering CEO of Vanguard Apex and locked onto me. I did not rush. I allowed my parents to sit in their paralyzing terror for a long, agonizing moment. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh grating sound that made my sister Brittany physically flinch. I stood up, commanding the center of the VIP perimeter the police officers had unwittingly created for us. I took a deliberate second to smooth out the skirt of my simple, understated black dress. It was the exact same dress my mother had openly mocked just hours earlier, calling it cheap, off-the-rack garbage, unfit for a corporate gala. I let my hands rest against the fabric, standing tall, entirely unashamed of who I was. I reached down to the floor next to my chair and picked up my unassuming leather tote bag. Patricia had spent the entire evening treating this bag like a toxic object, assuming it held nothing but cheap lipstick, generic calculator tape, and municipal bus passes. She had looked at it with absolute disgust. I unzipped the top compartment. I reached inside and grasped the heavy spine of the document waiting within. With a swift, practiced motion, I pulled out a massive 3-inch thick leather-bound binder. I dropped it directly onto the center of the dining table. The heavy, concussive thud of the binder striking the mahogany wood sounded like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. The crystal champagne flutes rattled violently against the china. Right in the center of the matte black cover, stamped in gleaming razor-sharp silver foil, was the unmistakable crest of Vanguard Apex. Patricia stared at the silver logo, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She covered her mouth in absolute horror, her diamond rings shaking against her pale cheeks. Richard looked from the heavy binder to my face, his eyes wide and completely hollowed out by fear. He was hyperventilating, staggering backward, until his hips hit the edge of a vacant chair. You always loved to play the victim of my career choices. Mom, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. It carried perfectly across the dead silence of the VIP section. You spent my entire adult life telling your country club friends that your oldest daughter was a cubicle rat. You told anyone who would listen that I was a bitter, low-level paper pusher who lacked the aggressive Sinclair corporate gene. You genuinely believed I sat in a windowless room punching calculator keys for pennies. Patricia shook her head rapidly, unable to form a coherent sentence. Her heavy diamond necklace seemed to be physically choking her as she realized the catastrophic scale of her mistake. I turned my gaze to my father. He was gripping the back of the chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the starched collar of his tuxedo shirt. You called me a glorified bean counter tonight, Richard. I continued, stepping closer to the table, dominating his shrinking space. You told me I had a small mind. You told me to stay out of high-level finance because I simply did not possess the intellect to comprehend a corporate acquisition. But while you were busy driving my grandfather's legacy into a mountain of unpayable commercial debt, I was busy hunting executives exactly like you. I placed my hand flat on the heavy Vanguard Apex binder, my fingers tracing the silver-embossed logo. I am not a mid-level accountant, Richard. I am the lead director of risk assessment and mergers and acquisitions at Vanguard Apex. The words struck my father like physical blows. He recoiled, his chest heaving as his brain desperately tried to process the magnitude of his ruin. The wealthy guests seated at the tables closest to us gasped audibly. The police captain, still standing guard, raised his eyebrows in profound realization, watching the ultimate corporate ambush unfold. Jamal controls the capital, I explained, my voice echoing cold and precise. Jamal is the architect of the empire, but I am the teeth. I am the final executive authority who decides which failing corporate carcass gets a billion-dollar lifeline and which one gets left to bleed out in bankruptcy court. I evaluate the ROT. I assess the liabilities. No acquisition moves forward without my signature. I hold the red pen. Preston let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He sank lower in his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. He knew exactly what a lead director of mergers and acquisitions did. He knew that his fake invoices, his phantom vendors, and his offshore Miami bank accounts were no longer just family secrets. They were federal liabilities sitting directly in the hands of the most ruthless private equity firm in the country. Brittany looked between Preston and me, her face ghostly pale. The arrogant, entitled smirk she had worn all evening was completely wiped from her features. She finally understood that her luxury cars and designer closets were built on a foundation of sand, and I was holding the sledgehammer. You thought Vanguard Apex was a faceless machine coming to save you tomorrow morning, I said, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. You thought you could intimidate me into signing away my 5% equity hand over a clean capitalization table, take your millions, and walk away a hero. You thought you had outsmarted the market. I grabbed the edge of the heavy black cover and flipped the binder open. Hundreds of pages of densely printed spreadsheets, forensic flowcharts, and highlighted bank transactions lay exposed under the glow of the chandeliers. When Sinclair Manufacturing's brokers approached Vanguard Apex begging for a buyout, Jamal did not recuse me from the account. I stated my tone, freezing the blood in his veins. He handed it directly to me. Richard tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling wheeze escaped his throat. You thought Vanguard Apex just discovered your company this week, I announced, raising my chin, delivering the final fatal hook. We did not. I am the invisible executive who was assigned to audit Sinclair Manufacturing. I have been quietly, systematically tearing apart your ledgers for the past 8 months. I tracked every shadow account. I verified every bounced payroll check. I documented every single toxic asset you tried to bury. I know exactly where the bodies are hidden, Richard. And I brought the shovels. I gripped the heavy black cover of the Vanguard Apex binder and flipped it open. The sharp snap of the metal rings echoed through the silent ballroom. 500 guests held their collective breath. The string quartet remained frozen on stage. Waiters stood like statues holding heavy trays of champagne. They suddenly realized they would never be paid for. I did not look at the crowd. I looked only at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I turned to the first tab, highlighted in bright, unforgiving crimson. Let us talk about the East Coast supply chain, I announced, my voice steady and amplified by the sheer acoustics of the stunned room. For the last 4 years, Sinclair Manufacturing has reported a steady 20% year-over-year growth in logistical acquisitions. You claim to own 6 state-of-the-art distribution warehouses in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. You use those supposed assets to secure a $90 million line of credit from a consortium of regional banks. I flipped the heavy page, pulling out a stark, high-resolution satellite image and tossing it across the table toward him. Those warehouses do not exist, Richard. They are empty, overgrown dirt lots in bankrupt industrial parks. You forged the municipal deeds. You fabricated the property tax records. You created phantom assets to borrow real money from real banks. I turned to the next section. Patricia flinched as the thick paper crinkled. And where did that $90 million go? I asked, turning my gaze to my mother. She was shaking visibly, her manicured hands gripping the table edge so tightly her knuckles were white. You always told me I lacked the refinement to understand true luxury. You sneered at my apartment and told me I was destined for a miserable middle-class life. You stood there 10 minutes ago and told me to take notes on how real wealth operates. Let us take some notes right now, Mom. I pulled a forensic accounting flowchart from the binder. It was a complex web of black arrows pointing to a single offshore destination. Sinclair Manufacturing did not invest that $90 million into operations or payroll. The money was funneled through a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Horizons, LLC, an account of which you, Patricia, are the sole registered signatory. You did not build wealth, you stole it. I pointed a steady finger directly at her throat. That heavy diamond necklace you are clutching right now. It was purchased with stolen commercial credit. Your weekly shopping trips to Paris, your luxury car leases, the very catering for this pathetic anniversary gala. All of it was paid for with money embezzled from a dying company. You are not high society royalty. You are technically completely bankrupt, and you are wearing stolen goods. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP section. Several board members seated at adjacent tables immediately stood up. Their faces were pale with panic, and they were already reaching for their phones to call their own attorneys. They were jumping off the sinking ship, realizing they were implicated in a massive federal fraud scheme. I flipped to the final tab. And then there is Preston, my golden boy brother-in-law. You told Brittany tonight that the Vanguard buyout would wipe away his federal tax liens and keep her untouchable. You said my shares would pay for his mistakes. But Preston did not just mismanage funds. He actively fabricated invoices to shell vendors to cover his massive sports gambling debts. The $2.4 million he lost last month was not an operational deficit. It was textbook wire fraud. I slammed the binders shut. The heavy concussive thud made both Preston and Brittany jump in their seats. Brittany was crying openly now, her mascara running down her cheeks, the reality of losing her mansion and her status finally crashing down on her. Vanguard Apex is not buying. Sinclair Manufacturing, Richard Lee declared, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. We are submitting this entire 800-page audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. You are not facing a corporate restructuring. You are facing a multi-count federal indictment for wire fraud, bank fraud, and corporate embezzlement. You are going to federal prison. Richard physically collapsed into his chair. His legs could no longer support him. He looked like a deflated, pathetic shell of a man. He stared at the closed binder, his chest heaving with violent, ragged breaths. His perfectly crafted world of dominance and control had been entirely annihilated by the daughter he considered a failure. But then a sick, desperate madness overtook his eyes. He realized he could not bully me. He could not intimidate me into silence. I held the executioner's axe and my grip was firm. So he turned to the one person he believed still operated by the ruthless, amoral code of the old boys club. Richard ignored me completely. He lunged forward across the table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher, and grabbed the sleeve of Jamal's tailored suit. Jamal, Richard pleaded, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed tone of male camaraderie. Listen to me, man to man. We are businessmen. We understand how the game is played. Jamal looked down at Richard's hand on his sleeve with an expression of absolute disgust, but Richard was too desperate to notice. You do not have to give this to the feds, Richard begged, his eyes wide and manic sweat dripping from his nose. You are Vanguard Apex. You have the power to bury this. You can buy the debt, sweep the phantom assets under the rug, and restructure the board quietly. We can make a deal right here tonight. I will give you the entire company for pennies on the dollar. You can take everything. Just fix the ledgers. We are family, Jamal. You cannot let your own father-in-law go to prison. Jamal slowly looked down at Richard's trembling, sweaty hand, clutching the sleeve of his immaculate charcoal suit. He did not say a word at first. He simply reached over and peeled my father's fingers back one by one, detaching him with the clinical repulsed precision of a surgeon removing a parasite. Richard stumbled forward as his grip failed his chest, heaving his eyes wide and completely feral with desperation. "You want to invoke the word family now?" Jamal said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that carried effortlessly in the dead silence. "You want to talk man to man about fixing the ledgers?" Jamal turned his back on my father. He walked up the short velvet stairs and stepped directly into the center of the main stage. The massive silver crest of Vanguard Apex glowed brightly behind him, casting long, imposing shadows across the dining tables. Jamal reached out and gripped the microphone resting on the podium. He lifted it to his mouth. A sharp, brief squeal of audio feedback sliced through the heavy, suffocating air of the ballroom, commanding absolute attention from every single person present. 500 members of the city's highest social echelon sat paralyzed, their cell phones held high, recording every agonizing second of the Sinclair family's public execution. As the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, I am issuing a formal, irrevocable public declaration. Jamal's voice boomed through the towering speaker systems, rolling over the terrified crowd like a tidal wave of cold reality. Effective immediately, as of this exact second, Vanguard Apex is officially and legally terminating our letter of intent to acquire Sinclair Manufacturing. The buyout is dead. A chaotic murmur rippled through the ballroom. Several prominent board members seated near the front abruptly shoved their chairs back and sprinted for the exit doors, frantically dialing their defense attorneys. They recognized a sinking ship, and they knew the federal blast radius was going to be massive. Jamal raised his free hand, demanding silence, and the room instantly obeyed. Vanguard Apex operates with a strict, uncompromising fiduciary duty to our investors. Jamal continued, his tone clinical, merciless, and completely detached. We do not acquire insolvent, actively fraudulent entities. And we certainly do not conspire to hide federal crimes from the Securities and Exchange Commission. My lead director of mergers and acquisitions has presented undeniable forensic proof of corporate embezzlement, systematic wire fraud, and the creation of phantom assets. Her audit is flawless, and her recommendation to terminate this deal is absolute. Jamal stepped away from the podium, taking the microphone with him as he paced the edge of the stage. He looked down into the VIP section, his eyes locking onto Richard and Patricia. The clinical corporate titan vanished, replaced instantly by the fiercely protective, devoted husband I had built my life with. "You stand there and beg for a lifeline because we are family," Jamal said, his voice ringing with a deep, resonant anger that made Patricia physically shrink into herself. "You plead for salvation based on a connection you have spent a decade treating like a disease. You forgot how you treated me, Richard. You forgot how you treated your own daughter." Jamal stopped pacing. He stood directly above them, a towering figure of judgment. "You did not want me in your family. You made that abundantly clear at every holiday dinner and every forced Sunday gathering. You sneered at my race. You made your pathetic coded jokes about my background. You assumed because I am a black man, I must be beneath you, financially and intellectually. You thought I was a charity case holding your daughter back from your ridiculous manufactured high society standards." Jamal pointed a steady, unwavering finger down at me, ensuring every camera in the room followed his gesture. "And you treated your own daughter even worse," he declared, his voice echoing with fierce pride. "You mocked her intelligence. You belittled her ambition. You celebrated Brittany's shallow, materialistic existence, while Rachel built an undeniable, razor-sharp mind for high finance. You treated her like garbage while she literally held your fate in her hands. Rachel is the most brilliant, ruthless, and capable executive I have ever had the privilege of knowing. She is my partner in life, and my absolute equal in business." Jamal lowered the microphone slightly, his gaze returning to Richard with lethal finality. "I do not do business with frauds. And I absolutely refuse to do business with racists who mistreat my wife." I stood tall at the edge of the table, feeling the immense grounding power of my husband's public validation. It was a united front. We were an impenetrable wall, and my parents had just shattered themselves against it. The finality of Jamal's words finally breached Patricia's thick layer of denial. She looked around at the fleeing guests, the recording cell phones, and the shattered remains of her social empire. The country club memberships, the charity galas, the vintage champagne. It was all evaporating right in front of her eyes. She grabbed the sides of her face, her carefully styled hair falling into disarray as she began to completely lose her grip on reality. "You cannot do this!" Patricia shrieked, her voice a hysterical, panicked wail that pierced the quiet hum of the ballroom. "You cannot just walk away. If Vanguard pulls out, we have nothing. The regional banks are going to call in the $90 million loan tomorrow morning. They will seize the house. They will seize the cars. They will take everything we own. We will be out on the street." I stepped forward, leaving the heavy binder on the table. I walked toward the edge of the stage, standing shoulder to shoulder with Jamal as he descended the stairs to join me. I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely no pity, only the cold satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming with icy surgical precision, "the banks do not own your debt anymore." Patricia's face drained of the manic red flush, replaced by a sickly translucent white. She blinked, her brain misfiring, entirely incapable of processing the words I had just spoken. Richard, however, understood immediately. A corporate predator knows exactly when a bigger, faster predator has just clamped its jaws around its neck. He slumped forward, his elbows hitting the table, his face burying into his trembling hands. A low, guttural moan escaped his chest. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a man watching his entire legacy burn to the ground. "What do you mean the banks do not own the debt?" Patricia demanded, her voice shaking violently. She looked frantically between Richard and me, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the fine linen tablecloth. "Of course they do. We have loans, we have mortgages. The regional consortium holds the paper." "Not anymore," I stated, stepping right up to the edge of the mahogany table. "You see, Mom, when you spend your entire life treating people like stepping stones, you completely fail to realize when you have stepped on a landmine. You spent years telling me I lacked the sophisticated mindset for high society finance. You told me I was too small-minded to understand how real wealth is generated and maintained. You were right about exactly one thing. I do not understand how you generate your wealth, because you do not generate it. You borrow it, and then you steal it." I leaned forward, planting my palms flat on the table, forcing her to look me in the eye. When Sinclair Manufacturing's financial rot became too massive to hide, the regional banking consortium panicked, I explained, my voice carrying cleanly across the silent ballroom. They were holding $50 million in toxic, unrecoverable commercial debt. They were staring down the barrel of a massive federal write-off. They were desperate to offload it. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out, allowing the brutal reality of the moment to crush the remaining oxygen out of their lungs. The remaining guests in the VIP section leaned in, utterly captivated by the systematic dismantling of the Sinclair dynasty. "Vanguard Apex did not terminate the buyout to leave you to the banks." I continued, my tone clinical and detached. "We terminated the equity buyout because buying Sinclair Manufacturing as a functioning company would mean assuming your legal liabilities. It would mean taking legal responsibility for Preston's phantom vendors and your offshore embezzlement. Vanguard is ruthless, but we are not stupid." Richard slowly raised his head from his hands. His eyes were completely bloodshot, his skin gray and slick with cold sweat. "You bought the paper," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel grinding together. "I authorized the purchase of the paper." I corrected him instantly, refusing to let him strip away my authority. "I personally signed the acquisition order." Vanguard Apex swooped in and bought your entire $50 million distressed debt portfolio from the banking consortium. And because you were hours away from catastrophic default, I bought it for pennies on the dollar. Patricia let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She gripped the edge of her chair, her body swaying slightly as if she might faint. "You own the company debt. I own everything." "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, unwavering register. "Vanguard Apex is now the sole and absolute creditor for Sinclair Manufacturing. But we did not just buy the corporate paper. I audited your personal guarantees." Richard tied everything to the company to keep the credit lines open. I began ticking off the items on my fingers, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the woman who had spent decades making me feel like a peasant in her own kingdom. I own the mortgage to the primary estate. I hold the titles to the 3 Mercedes-Benz SUVs currently parked in the valet lot outside. I own the commercial lease on your private country club cabana. I own the credit lines that pay for your weekly trips to Fifth Avenue. Every single asset you possess was leveraged against Sinclair Manufacturing, and Vanguard Apex just bought the master key. Brittany let out a loud, ugly sob. She grabbed Preston's arm, but he violently shook her off, too consumed by the paralyzing fear of his own impending federal prosecution to care about her lost luxury cars. Brittany looked at me, her face smeared with expensive cosmetics, her fake Chanel bag sitting uselessly on the floor. "You cannot do this to us, Rachel," Brittany pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "We are your family. You are going to make us homeless." "You made yourselves homeless, Brittany," I replied without a single shred of empathy. "You chose to live a counterfeit lifestyle funded by federal wire fraud. You chose to sit at this table tonight and mock my dress while wearing diamonds paid for by phantom warehouses. I am simply the auditor executing the market correction." I turned my attention back to my father. He was staring at the heavy black binder on the table, as if it were a bomb counting down its final seconds. "You always told me that business is a man's world, Richard," I said, throwing his own misogynistic, outdated garbage directly back into his face. "You told me to focus on finding a good husband because I lacked the killer instinct to survive a boardroom. Well, I found a phenomenal husband, and he let me borrow his boardroom to absolutely dismantle yours." Jamal stepped up right behind me, his physical presence an undeniable reinforcement of my authority. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The image of the two of us united, powerful and completely in control, was the ultimate refutation of my family's lifelong narrative. "What happens now?" Patricia whispered, her voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogant command. She looked like a terrified, trapped child. "What are you going to do to us?" I did not answer immediately. I reached back into my unassuming tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my keys, closing around a thick, sealed manila envelope. I pulled it out and held it up to the harsh light of the chandeliers. "I am doing my job," I stated. I tossed the envelope onto the table. It slid across the smooth mahogany and stopped exactly an inch from Richard's trembling hands. The bold red lettering stamped across the front of the envelope was impossible to misinterpret. "That is an immediate, unconditional notice of default," I declared, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "Sinclair Manufacturing is officially in breach of its lending covenants." The grace period expired the second I signed that document. Richard stared at the envelope, entirely paralyzed. "You do not have 30 days. You do not have a week. You do not even have until Monday morning," I told them, delivering the final devastating blow. "Vanguard Apex is executing an immediate asset seizure. Tomorrow morning at 6, corporate liquidators will arrive at the factory. And at 7, a private security firm will arrive at your estate to change the locks." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, but it lasted only a fraction of a second before the illusion of my sister's perfect life violently shattered. Brittany let out a piercing, unhinged shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. She scrambled backward, her chair tipping over and crashing onto the floor. She looked down at her hands, staring at her diamond rings, as if they had suddenly turned to lead, realizing that every single piece of jewelry she wore was financed by fraud and was now technically the property of my husband's firm. She whipped her head toward my parents. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure panic. "You lied to me," she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger right at Richard's chest. "You sat in my living room last week and promised me the company was generating record profits. You told me the Vanguard acquisition was just a strategic merger to expand your market share. You told me my trust fund was secure." Patricia reached out, her hands trembling as she tried to grab her favorite daughter's arm. "Brittany, sweetie, please lower your voice. People are staring. We will figure this out. Do not touch me," Brittany shrieked violently, slapping Patricia's hands away. "There is nothing to figure out. You are bankrupt. You are broke. You dragged me into this mess, and now I have nothing." Brittany spun around and locked her panicked eyes onto Preston. Her husband was actively sweating through his expensive tuxedo, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking anywhere but at her. "And you?" Brittany sneered, her voice dropping into a venomous, hysterical register. $2.4 million in gambling debts. Phantom vendors. You told me you were making brilliant investments in the logistics sector. You told me you were securing our future. Instead, you are a cheating, stealing fraudster who just lost everything we own. You dragged me down with you. Preston held up his hands, completely pathetic, trying to shush her while nervously glancing at the police officers standing just a few feet away. Keep your mouth shut, Brittany, he hissed through his teeth. You are admitting to federal crimes in a room full of witnesses. Brittany did not care. The reality of impending poverty had completely short-circuited her brain. The country club lunches, the spa days, the luxury vacations, they were all gone, replaced by the terrifying specter of asset seizure and federal prison. She realized in that exact moment that the only person in the room who possessed the power to save her was the sister she had spent her entire life degrading. Brittany pivoted sharply. She lunged toward me, completely abandoning her anger and replacing it with a sickening, desperate pleading. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. "Rachel, you have to stop this!" Brittany begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You have to tell Jamal to fix it. He is a billionaire. $2 million is nothing to him. It is pocket change. He can pay off Preston's debts today. He can clear the ledgers. You can buy the house back for Mom and Dad. You have to do this for me. I am your sister." I looked at her tear-streaked face. I looked at the utter desperation in her eyes. And I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that sliced through her hysteria. "I am sorry, Brittany," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. I tilted my head, looking down at her with absolute clinical detachment. "I cannot possibly help you. I am just an ugly, broke auditor, remember?" Brittany gasped, physically stepping back as I threw her exact words from an hour ago directly into her face. "I lack the sophisticated mindset required to understand your elite financial struggles," I continued, my tone dripping with icy mockery. "I sit in a windowless room punching calculator keys. I do not have the resources to bail out a degenerate gambler. And I certainly do not have $15,000 to spare for a fake Chanel bag." Brittany let out a strangled gasp. Her eyes darted down to the quilted leather handbag resting on the floor near her overturned chair. Several wealthy socialites standing at the adjacent tables visibly leaned in, their eyes wide, as I publicly stripped away her final layer of manufactured prestige. "That is right, Brittany," I stated clearly, ensuring the entire VIP section heard me. "When you run a forensic audit on a family's finances, you see exactly where the money stops. Your credit cards have been maxed out for 6 months. You bought that counterfeit bag out of the trunk of a car in a strip mall parking lot because Preston drained your checking accounts to pay his bookies. You are wearing a cheap knockoff, and you are standing in the middle of a ballroom demanding a multi-million-dollar handout." The humiliation was total. It was absolute. Brittany collapsed onto her knees, right there on the hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Patricia sank down next to her, clutching her daughter, both of them crying over the shattered remains of their fake, opulent lives. Richard simply sat in his chair, completely catatonic, staring blankly at the silver Vanguard Apex logo stamped on the binder that had ruined him. While the Sinclair family broke down in the center of the room, Preston decided he had seen enough. He did not look at his weeping wife. He did not look at his ruined parents-in-law. Preston slowly pushed his chair back, making zero noise. He turned his body away from the stage and began to edge backwards, sliding into the shadows beyond the glow of the chandeliers. He was moving toward the heavy velvet curtains that covered the service exit leading to the hotel kitchens. He thought the chaos of Brittany's meltdown would provide the perfect cover for a cowardly escape. He was wrong. Before Preston could take 3 steps toward the heavy double doors, a massive uniformed figure stepped directly into his path, completely blocking the exit. It was the police captain. An hour ago, this captain had been eager to arrest my husband, just to appease Richard's wealthy entitlement. But the captain had been standing close enough to hear every single word I read from that audit binder. He had watched the absolute destruction of Richard Sinclair, and he recognized immediately who held the real power in this city now. He saw a billionaire CEO and a lead director of M&A who had just handed the authorities a perfect, fully documented federal fraud case on a silver platter. The captain was a pragmatist, and he was eager to prove his worth to the new king and queen of the boardroom. The captain rested his hand heavily on his utility belt, staring down at Preston with a cold, authoritative glare. Going somewhere so soon, the captain asked, his voice booming over the sound of Brittany's sobbing. Preston froze, his face draining of all remaining color. He took a terrified step backward, but two other officers immediately moved up to flank the captain, effectively boxing Preston into a corner. "I was just going to the restroom," Preston stammered, his voice cracking, his hands shaking wildly. "I do not think so," the captain said, stepping closer and forcing Preston to retreat back toward the light. "We just heard a very interesting public presentation regarding phantom vendors, offshore shell accounts, and multi-million-dollar wire fraud. Since your name was featured quite prominently in that audit, I think you need to stay exactly where you are. We have some questions about those missing funds, and I am quite certain the federal authorities are going to want to hear your answers." Preston stood frozen against the heavy velvet curtains, the color draining from his face as the police captain and his officers formed an impenetrable wall around him. The metallic clink of handcuffs being unpouched echoed sharply against the wood paneling. But the sudden arrest of the golden son-in-law was merely background noise to the absolute collapse happening at the center of the ballroom. I turned my attention back to the mahogany table. Richard was a broken shell staring blankly at the Vanguard Apex binder, as if trying to decode a foreign language. Brittany was hyperventilating on the floor, clutching her fake Chanel bag like a life preserver. And then there was my mother, Patricia Sinclair, the undisputed queen of Boston high society, the woman who had spent 30 years cultivating an image of untouchable diamond-encrusted perfection, finally realized that her reign was completely over. The money was gone, the status was gone, the illusion was dead. Patricia looked at the police officers detaining Preston. She looked at the panicked guests whispering and pointing cell phone cameras directly at her. Then she looked up at me. The arrogant sneer she had worn like a crown for my entire life vanished instantly. In its place was a mask of sheer, desperate terror. Her knees buckled beneath her. The heavy silk of her couture gown pooled around her as she collapsed onto the hardwood floor right at my feet. She lunged forward and grabbed the hem of my dress, her manicured fingers clutching the fabric with a frantic, white-knuckled grip. "Rachel, please," she sobbed, tilting her head back to look up at me. Real tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving dark, ugly tracks of mascara across her perfectly powdered skin. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to me. I am your mother. You are my firstborn, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. We are blood. You have to remember family loyalty. We are a family. You cannot let them take our home. Please, Rachel, I am begging you. Look into your heart and remember that I gave you life." I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply stood there and looked down at the woman who had terrorized me for 3 decades. My expression remained completely blank. I felt the comforting, solid warmth of Jamal stepping closer. His presence a silent anchor against the pathetic display at my feet. Family loyalty. I repeated, my voice, calm, projecting clearly into the silent ballroom so that every judging peer could hear exactly what the great Patricia Sinclair was truly made of. "Let us talk about family loyalty, Mom. Let us talk about the Thanksgiving I spent sitting alone in my freezing college dorm room because you told me there was not enough space in the car for me and Brittany's new ski equipment. Let us talk about Christmas 5 years ago when you handed me a $20 gift card to a grocery store while you bought Brittany a diamond tennis bracelet, and then you laughed with your friends about how I lacked the refinement to appreciate fine jewelry." Patricia whimpered, her grip on my dress tightening, but she had absolutely no defense. I kept my voice perfectly level, weaponizing her past actions with clinical precision. "Let us talk about my wedding day." I continued, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the silent room. "I invited you. I begged you to come. I sat in that bridal suite, hoping that just for one day, you could put your arrogance aside and be a mother. You did not even bother to RSVP. You took Brittany to Paris for a shopping spree and posted photos drinking champagne in front of the Eiffel Tower while I walked down the aisle alone. You spent my entire life subjecting me to constant calculated psychological torment. You mocked my career. You ridiculed my husband. You told me I was a failure because I refused to marry a rich fraudster like Preston. You used your maternal bond as a weapon to make me feel completely worthless. You isolated me, humiliated me, and demanded I be grateful for the privilege of standing in your shadow. You told everyone I was socially unfit because I wanted to work instead of attending your shallow charity luncheons. You do not care about blood, I stated, staring directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. You only care about the bank accounts attached to it. For 30 years you looked at me and saw nothing but a massive disappointment. But tonight you look at me and you see a bank vault. You are not crying because you love your daughter. You are crying because you are terrified of flying coach and buying your own groceries. You are mourning the loss of your stolen credit cards, not our relationship. You invoke the word family as a shield only when you have exhausted every other option to maintain your fake empire. But you do not know the first thing about family. I turned my head slightly, looking at the man standing beside me. Jamal stood tall, his gaze fixed on my mother with cold, unwavering judgment. Jamal is my family. I declared, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. He supported me when I had absolutely nothing. He respected me when you treated me like dirt. He loved me when you told me I was entirely unlovable. He is the only family I recognize, and he is the only family I will ever need. I looked back down at Patricia. Her mouth was open in a silent wail. I took a deliberate, forceful step backward. The sudden movement ripped the fabric of my dress right out of her desperate, grasping hands. She fell forward, her palms slapping against the cold hardwood floor. I did not offer her a hand. I turned my back on her, leaving Patricia Sinclair weeping uncontrollably on her knees, completely surrounded by a circle of her high society peers, looking down at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. The silence in the room was no longer just shock. It was the suffocating vacuum left behind by a detonated bomb. I did not spare another glance for the woman sobbing at my feet. My attention shifted to the head of the table. Richard Sinclair was a man who had spent 35 years cultivating an aura of absolute invincibility. He had built his manufacturing empire on a foundation of ruthless intimidation, crushing competitors and discarding loyal employees the moment they outlived their usefulness. He had styled himself as a Wall Street titan, a man whose mere presence in a boardroom commanded immediate deference. He had spent my entire life acting as a god among mortals, dictating the terms of reality for everyone around him. But as I watched him now, that entire facade evaporated. Richard stumbled backward away from the table, his heavily starched tuxedo shirt suddenly looking entirely too large for his deflating frame. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. He reached up with a trembling, liver-spotted hand and clutched tightly at the fabric over his chest. His face, normally a ruddy, commanding red, had drained to a sickly, translucent gray. He hit the wood-paneled wall of the ballroom and simply gave out. His legs folded beneath him, and he slid down the expensive wallpaper, leaving a smear of cold sweat against the polished mahogany trim. He landed hard on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the heavy black Vanguard Apex binder, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The panic in the room was highly contagious. While Richard gasped for air on the floor, the surviving executives and board members of Sinclair Manufacturing who had attended the gala finally snapped out of their paralyzed stupor. They were corporate sharks trained by Richard himself, and they smelled blood in the water. I watched as Arthur Vance, the chief financial officer, who had spent a decade rubber-stamping my father's fraudulent acquisitions, violently shoved his chair back. The heavy wooden chair tipped over, crashing loudly, but Arthur did not care. He did not even look at Richard. He pulled his cell phone from his breast pocket and began barking frantic, panicked orders to his personal defense attorney before he even reached the exit doors. 2 other senior vice presidents immediately followed suit. They gathered in a tight, terrified stir near the coat check, frantically whispering and pointing, accusing fingers back toward the man bleeding out on the ballroom floor. They were already drafting their immunity deals in their heads. They were preparing to throw Richard entirely under the bus, eager to surrender every dirty secret, every hidden offshore ledger, and every phantom warehouse deed in exchange for reduced federal sentences. Richard had taught them that loyalty was a liability, and tonight he was reaping the exact harvest he had sown. They were abandoning ship, leaving the captain to drown in his own making. Richard saw them leaving. Through the haze of his impending panic attack, he watched his most trusted lieutenants sprinting toward the exits to sell him out to the Department of Justice. The realization hit him with the catastrophic force of a freight train. There would be no corporate restructuring. There would be no golden parachute or quiet early retirement on a private island. He was going to lose his company, his mansion, his reputation, and his freedom. His entire 35-year legacy was being publicly obliterated. He was going to spend the final chapters of his life in a federal penitentiary, wearing a cheap jumpsuit, completely stripped of the power he had worshipped above his own family. He let out a hollow, defeated wheeze, pulling at his collar as if the tuxedo itself was choking him. The rest of the elite crowd watched the spectacle in horrified fascination. These were the people my parents had desperately tried to impress, the high society gatekeepers they had stolen millions to appease. And now those same people were looking at the Sinclair family like they were a hazardous waste spill. No one stepped forward to help Patricia up from the floor. No one offered Richard a glass of water. They simply watched, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity, mentally crossing the Sinclairs off every future guest list, charity board, and country club roster in the city. The social exile was instantaneous and absolute. I stood there taking it all in. I felt no guilt. I felt no residual daughterly affection. I only felt the profound cleansing weight of absolute justice. They had tried to bury me, and instead I had become the architect of their ruin. The destruction was total. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to expose. The Sinclair empire was officially dead. Jamal walked over to the edge of the VIP section. He spotted the terrified maitre d' standing frozen near a dessert cart, staring at the chaos with wide, unblinking eyes. Jamal held out the wireless microphone. The man scrambled forward and took it with shaking hands, bowing his head slightly in an unconscious display of utter submission to the man who truly controlled the room. Jamal turned his back on the wreckage of my family. He walked back to where I was standing tall and unbothered amidst the chaos. He reached out and wrapped a strong, warm arm securely around my waist, pulling me gently against his side. The physical contrast was absolute. My parents were broken, bankrupt, and crying on the floor in front of hundreds of people. Jamal and I stood together in unbreakable partnership built on genuine respect and unshakable trust. We had faced the monsters of my past and absolutely annihilated them. Jamal looked down at me, his dark eyes soft and filled with a fierce protective pride that made my heart swell. He completely ignored the whimpering sounds coming from my mother and the ragged, pathetic breathing of my father. He focused entirely on me, grounding me in the reality of the beautiful life we had built together. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Apex?" he asked, his voice a calm, steady harbor in the middle of the storm. I smiled, the tension completely leaving my shoulders for the first time in my life. "Yes," I murmured, slipping my arm through his. "Take me home." We turned our backs on the wreckage of the Sinclair family. I did not look down at my mother weeping on the floor. I did not look at my father gasping for breath against the wood paneling. Nor did I spare a glance for my sister, who was still hyperventilating over her fake handbag. I simply locked my eyes on the heavy double doors at the far end of the room and walked forward. As Jamal and I moved toward the center aisle of the ballroom, a remarkable thing happened. The crowd of Boston and New York's elite physically recoiled. The sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos parted for us, instantly creating a wide, clear path leading straight to the exit. These were the exact same people who had sneered at me hours ago. They had whispered behind their champagne flutes, mocking my simple dress, dismissing me as Patricia's disappointing, unremarkable daughter. Now they pressed their backs against the dining tables, lowering their eyes as we passed. They were looking at royalty. More importantly, they were looking at the woman who now owned their debts, their investments, and their futures through Vanguard Apex. The silence in the room was absolute, punctuated only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels on the polished floor. Old society matriarchs who had judged my career choices suddenly looked terrified. Arrogant hedge fund managers who had enabled my father's schemes held their breath, praying I would not turn my forensic gaze upon their portfolios. It was the sound of a new era beginning, and I relished every single second of it. Jamal kept his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me with a quiet, lethal confidence. We pushed through the heavy gilded doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the grand hotel lobby. The suffocating silence of the ballroom was instantly replaced by an explosion of noise and blinding light. Jamal had not simply planned a corporate takeover. He had engineered a public, inescapable execution. Hours earlier, while the gala was just beginning, he had quietly tipped off every major financial publication on the Eastern Seaboard from the Wall Street Journal to Bloomberg, promising them the exclusive scoop on a major corporate restructuring that would redefine the market. The press had arrived expecting a standard merger announcement featuring Richard Sinclair cutting a ribbon. Instead, they walked into the greatest financial scandal of the decade. Dozens of reporters swarmed the velvet ropes cordoning off the lobby. Camera flashes detonated like strobe lights, temporarily blinding the hotel security staff, who were frantically trying to maintain order. Microphones were shoved aggressively over the barricades. Mr. Apex, is it true? Vanguard is absorbing Sinclair Manufacturing. Rachel, what is your response to the federal fraud allegations against your father? Are the rumors of phantom vendors true? I paused halfway across the marble floor. I turned to face the wall of cameras standing tall beside my billionaire husband. I did not shout over the noise. I did not act like the hysterical, emotional woman my mother had always painted me to be. I offered a calm, perfectly practiced corporate smile. Sinclair Manufacturing has suffered from decades of severe financial mismanagement and gross negligence, I stated, my voice echoing clearly and firmly over the chaos. Vanguard Apex has officially acquired all controlling debts. Our independent forensic audit has uncovered extensive fraudulent activity, which has already been handed over to the federal authorities. We are cooperating fully with the Department of Justice to ensure that the criminals responsible are held fully accountable. Thank you, and good evening. The reporters erupted into a frenzy, screaming follow-up questions and demanding specifics. But their attention was suddenly and violently diverted. The heavy ballroom doors swung open behind us. Two burly police officers marched Preston into the lobby. His designer tuxedo was rumpled, his hands securely cuffed behind his back, his face buried in his chest to hide from the flashing cameras as he was walked toward the exit. Right behind him, paramedics were wheeling Richard Sinclair out on a stretcher. An oxygen mask was strapped tightly over his face, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Arthur Vance and the remaining board members scrambled alongside the gurney, aggressively hiding their faces behind their leather briefcases, running from the very media they usually courted. The press completely abandoned us, rushing the barricades to capture the spectacular downfall of the Sinclair patriarch and his golden son-in-law. The cameras immortalized the exact moment my father's 35-year empire turned to ash. His Wall Street reputation was utterly obliterated. His future was a federal prison cell, and it was broadcasting live on every financial network in the world. Jamal chuckled softly, a low, rich sound that vibrated in his chest. He gently guided me away from the media circus and toward the revolving glass doors. The crisp night air hit my face, smelling of rain and city exhaust. A uniformed chauffeur stood waiting at the curb, holding open the heavy rear door of a sleek midnight black Maybach. The vehicle was a fortress of tinted glass and quiet luxury, idling smoothly at the edge of the chaos. I stopped right beside the open door. I turned around and looked back through the glass facade of the hotel. I could see the red and blue police lights reflecting off the towering marble columns. I saw the reporters swarming the exits like vultures on a fresh carcass. I saw my sister Brittany being escorted out by a hotel manager, her mascara completely ruining her face, screaming wildly at a photographer who got too close. I looked at the absolute ruins of my toxic family. For my entire life, they had tried to convince me that I was stupid. They told me I was useless because I refused to play their shallow, manipulative games. They thought they owned the board, they thought they controlled the rules. But they never realized that while they were busy playing dress-up in their stolen jewelry, I was learning how to buy the entire casino. I did not win by screaming. I did not win by throwing a tantrum on the floor like Patricia. I won by mastering the exact game they thought they owned, and using their own bottomless vanity to orchestrate their absolute destruction. Jamal stepped up behind me. He reached down and gently took my right hand. He raised it to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. His dark eyes met mine over my hand, burning with an intense, quiet devotion. "You played a perfect game, my love," he murmured. I smiled, sliding into the soft leather interior of the Maybach. Jamal climbed in right beside me, and the chauffeur firmly shut the door, instantly cutting off the noise of the wailing sirens and the shouting reporters. The heavy car glided seamlessly away from the curb. I leaned my head against Jamal's shoulder, breathing in the scent of his cologne, watching the flashing lights of the hotel fade into the distance as we drove off into the glittering electric expanse of the New York night. The Sinclair empire was dead, but mine was just beginning. The story of Rachel's triumph over the Sinclair family teaches a powerful lesson about the true meaning of family. We are often conditioned to believe that biological ties demand unconditional loyalty, even in the face of relentless psychological abuse. However, Rachel's journey demonstrates that true family is chosen, built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love, just as she found with Jamal. Walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of betrayal, but a courageous step towards self-preservation. Share your thoughts on setting firm boundaries with toxic family members, and please leave a comment below.